Okay, I see you recording, so I'll go ahead and welcome everybody. Hello, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Shyla Davison, and I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator for iDigBio. Welcome to today's webinar, AI and Natural History Collections, Promise, Pitfalls, and Perspectives. We're so glad you're joining us, and thank you for our panelists for joining us as well. If you've attended our webinars in the past, typically I normally start with an introduction to iDigBio and the webinar series. Since we have a full and exciting lineup today, I'm going to skip the usual introduction and go over today's format. It's a little bit different. We'll be moving through a panel-like discussion, and because of the amount of material the speakers hope to cover, we may need to forego the traditional Q&A. So if questions come up afterwards, please feel free to shoot them towards the panelist afterwards. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Emily so she can start sharing her screen.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here today. So I'm just going to say kind of quickly what our format is going to be, and then we'll get started. So you see a variety of people here from iDigBio, but then also the folks who are going to be our panelists today. And what we all share is that we are interested in using AI for natural history collections in one way or another. And so what we're going to do is we're each going to introduce ourselves by telling you something about our interests in AI with natural history collections and something that we're excited about in this area. And then once we've all introduced ourselves, we've got kind of three topical areas and questions under each of those areas that we're just going to talk about and discuss how it touches on the work that we're doing. And then, like Shyla said, if we have time left at the end, then we'll be happy to get questions from you all as well. So this is our list of speakers. We do have one apology today, which is Laura. She's not going to be able to join us. So that means, Leanna, you're going to be up for our first introduction. So here is Leanna.
Hi, I'm Leanna Fader. I am the Digital Asset Manager at NYBG. I oversee all of our imaging and the images as they go into our database and all the associated metadata with our multimedia. Emily, I see your slide, but are we going to go through our individual slides?
Yeah, did it not advance for you?
We're looking at like your browser and can see all
Oh.
of the slides. It's not in
Oh.
presentation mode.
Oh, interesting. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
How about I do this? I'm going to change my mode and let me try again and see if that fixes it. How about that?
Perfect,
Better?
thank you.
Okay, there we go.
Great. So one of the things, or I would say the thing I'm probably the most excited about is using AI to go back through our massive amounts of data that we've already amassed as a community and try to improve it with automated quality control at a scale that I think it would take a human a very long time to do. And so I have shown here image quality control because that's relevant to my work. But I think there are many opportunities for using AI to improve the data that we already have, which I think is essential going forward. So that's what I'm most excited about.
Cool, thank you. Let's see. James, you're next. This is in alphabetical order.
Hi, so I'm James Mickley. I'm the curator at Oregon State University Herbarium, and we have been using Will Weaver's tool Voucher Vision for all of our specimen transcription for several years now. And I'm really excited to see that hopefully that will be coming to Symbiota soon in sort of a point-and-click interface where everybody else can do this kind of thing. And so this is just an example from our collection where I did the point and click, and this is, a handwritten label. It's not the easiest, and there are some mistakes here, but the AI has gotten most of the transcription right and saved us some time in the process. And so we will do human quality control on this to fix the little errors. So hopefully that will be helpful to everybody else as well when it comes to Symbiota.
Cool, thank you. Oh, I'm next. So I'm excited about a lot of things with AI, with the potential for our collections, but one of the ones that I'm most excited about is the development of tools for extracting traits from specimens, and specifically traits that might be relevant for conservation or climate change related actions. And I'm thinking about things that like actually could relate to management or developing policies or plans to carry out conservation on the ground. So this is there's a picture from on the left, that's from Leaf Machine, which is another of Will's tools, and then on the right is just like, I think we're all familiar with the types of data that you can get out of a specimen. So all of these different types of things might have value for conservation, and again, sort of extracting those data at scale is something I'm really interested in. Jordan, you're next.
Hi, I'm Jordan Teicher. I'm the director of the herbarium at Missouri Botanical Garden. So we're also using AI in a variety of different projects in collaboration with different institutions. One that I thought I would highlight, just because it was different from the ones that were already highlighted, is using hyperspectral scans of specimens. So the reflectance measurements from a very high sensitivity spectroradiometer that makes this kind of patterned wave of reflectance across the visible and non-visible spectrums of light. And then we can use that. Species seem to be fairly consistent within them, to use that to develop species identification models. This is especially exciting for things that are really difficult to identify, or when you have ecological collections that are often sterile. We have a huge pile here of sterile Laraceae specimens from the neotropics that our curator emeritus Hank van der Werf would love to have identified, but he says, I can't identify them without the flowers. So this was a neat process led by Matthew Austin. We looked at Vitis as sort of a test case with really good performance, overall 95% accuracy in species identification. What you see in that bottom right there are cases of mismatches or low confidence scores that came back from the model, which we then passed to a curator to verify. We found that a couple of them were indeed misidentified, and the model had identified them correctly. Other ones didn't have enough characters to identify them confidently. So really the only thing that we have to go on is the hyperspectral, or if we wanted to complement with DNA. So I also like it as a highlight of that collaboration between curatorial expertise and AI as a tool. This is not to supplant or replace the expert identifications, but it is a good way of filtering specimens through to get them to the people who can work on them.
Cool. Thank you, Jordan. Kim, you're next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kim Watson. I'm Assistant Director of the Herbarium for Botanical Information Management at NYBG, and I manage the Steer Herbarium's collections management system, that's EMU. So within which we've managed 4.8 million specimens of our total holdings of 7.8 million. So we've been digitizing for a long time. And over the last year, we've been experimenting with Will Weaver's Voucher Vision AI tool to transcribe the backlog of specimens for which we have skeletal data and images, but not yet fully transcribed and parsed occurrence data. So I'm really excited about use of this tool and others to help us accelerate the rate at which we can complete the digitization of our holdings, which I never thought would happen in my lifetime, but maybe it will. And as part of this process, I'm excited at how AI tools can help us, not just transcribe the data into a CSV, but also then migrate those data into our very particular database, match them to our set records of authority files for people and for higher level geography, and do that in an automated way. Of course, with a human verifying and performing quality control steps, but definitely increasing the rate at which we can do that. And then I'm also excited at the dramatic improvements for us to capture non-Roman characters in our database and in our occurrence data, and to be able to display those online, something that we haven't been able to do very well to date. So I'm really excited at making those data accessible to a wider audience.
Cool, thank you. And Will.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Will Weaver. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Michigan. And I really enjoy making tools that allow us to extract quantitative trait data from particularly herbarium specimens. And lately, I've also been designing tools that rely on large language models to extract the label data from museum specimens. And clearly, I'm excited about all of those tools, and I'm happy to talk about methods in detail. But one thing I wanted to talk about in today's webinar is particularly some of the dirtier sides of using AI in all of this. So with our Voucher Vision API, we've tried to make it a point to be transparent about how much electricity we're using, our carbon footprint. It's a very complicated subject. Most of the time, we actually don't really know how much carbon we're emitting every time we process a specimen. But with voucher vision, we provide 3 different estimates based on various studies that people at Microsoft and Google have performed, since they are, the ones that host all of these models. So the long and short of it, voucher vision has processed about 130,000 specimens to date, and that has consumed probably 550-ish kilowatt hours of electricity, which is comparable to maybe a small house in the US. It's comparable to one -80 freezer for a month and a fraction of what a fume hood consumes. So I just provide those as a reference point. We always hear about the impact that AI is having, and we're aware of that. So it's important to document the impact that we're having and minimize it as much as possible. One of those minimizations is to hopefully only run this once. So once we have a specimen, we're only processing it once. It's not like we're continually processing things with all these AI tools. The last thing, in our field, we have 2 main options when it comes to large language models. We can rely on proprietary closed weight models, something like Gemini or ChatGPT. We also have a huge variety of open weight models where I could download it to my computer and run it myself. There are pros and cons to both of these, and I'm happy to get into that later on.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. And I realized I didn't introduce myself. I'm Emily Sessa. I'm the director of the herbarium at the New York Botanical Garden. And so now we're going to get into the meat of our content for today. So we have 3 slides like this that are each sort of addressing a different kind of topical area that have some questions that we collectively came up with as a group that we thought would be interesting to talk about all together. So the first of these areas is sort of questions related to procedure, so how we spend our time and things like that. So you can see the questions here, so I'll read through them quickly, and then I'm going to paste them into the chat and stop sharing because it's not fun to look at this for the next hour. So the questions in this area, so number 1, how much time should we devote to generating new data versus further curating older data or doing quality control? For in terms of best practices for AI and collections, what do we think are the most important ones to spend our time developing? Attribution, how can we or should we handle attribution when it comes to the various steps that AI adds when we're processing things? And then what's an acceptable error rate and what kinds of errors would we consider to be acceptable? So I will stop sharing and I'm gonna paste that set of questions into the chat so that everyone can see them. And for our panelists, we don't necessarily need to go in order of these questions. Does anyone have a favorite that they want to kick us off with? Jordan, I think you were the originator of question number 1.
I don't know that I was, but I would be happy to, to talk about it because I thought it was a really interesting topic. And I don't know that I have a clear position on it other than it's interesting because our analytical tools are developing at the same time as our data processing tools. And so the tools that we're using to generate data are also complemented by, for example, increasingly sophisticated AI models for pulling data out. And so that to me sometimes feels like, well, if you can train an AI model to know, for example, that it's going to encounter a certain error rate or it's going to encounter a certain amount of missing information, we can put that into our analyses in ways that maybe make up for the lower quality or supplement some of the lower quality. That obviously depends on what question you're asking. So we have really, really big data questions, but a lot of the things as an herbarium curator that I find the most interesting are the small data questions, like things from digitization where you uncover just a really interesting historic collection, you uncover a rare species. And so, yeah, I kind of have mixed feelings about it. I think to my sort of general instinct is that we're still very much in a data discovery mode about herbaria. Just a huge portion of our collections and in other natural history collections are not accessible in any way, and they are invisible to the whole world. So I think I still would err on the side of trying to expedite getting something out there for everything, not ignoring quality control, but I don't know that my inclination would be to slow or to pivot our technical energies towards improving quality control at the expense of that basic discovery period, just because of the volume of collections that we haven't covered yet. I lied. That is a pretty clear preference.
Anyone else want to jump in on that? Leanna?
I think I feel a little differently. I feel a little more inclined to focus on improving the amount of data that we already have, which is there is so much that we don't have available yet, but we do have a lot of data. And I think that improving the quality of the data that we already have possibly makes it more usable than just adding a little bit more of data that's similarly low quality. Not low quality, but doesn't have as much information associated with it. I think that we can't do everything. We obviously have to keep digitizing. It's because I want to keep having a job too. But what I would like to do is see how we can use AI to focus on these quality control issues so that we can use our people to keep adding data and hopefully have more time to do these things and use AI to help us improve the quality of the data that we already have so it's more interoperable, more accessible. It can be used to train better AI models because the data that we have is being used to train AI. So if it's not very high quality, I don't know which like feeds itself into a loop of just eating itself. We want to put really high quality data out so that it can be used to the best of its ability. That's my position.
James?
Yeah, I definitely agree with Jordan in that there's so much data that's just not even searchable, and it's really important to just have something out there that you can search for, even if it's potentially imperfect. But one of the nice things about using AI for quality control is that what would have been a tremendous task before is now something that we could run in a few hours and flag stuff. And so it's another way to flag records that need some more human input or that might have issues, and a very efficient way of doing that. So maybe we can do both.
Yeah, I think that's my position is that I don't want that part of it to be forgotten. I think that as we continue to amass data, we should do it responsibly and remember that there's still a lot of data that could be improved on.
Will?
I agree. And I think one other aspect that we will talk about at some point is just translating multiple languages. There's a lot of specimens that we've digitized in the past that we have not completely, extracted all of the text from those labels, because they're from a different language or we didn't have funding to extract those fields in the first place. So like James is saying, I think there's a place for running our existing and even potentially our transcribed images through some of these tools just to sort of complete records that are partial or might be missing non-English text. So that's another important thing. I don't know when we'll talk about that, but that is a point where we need to create best practices. How do you handle a specimen that has 3 or 4 languages on it? We'll need a network of people that do speak those languages so that we can do some quality control to see how well these tools actually work. Anecdotally, it is impressive to have it, read all of the languages present on a specimen and translate them into a common language. And that can go both ways. It doesn't always have to be to English. It could be from any language to any other language. So that also opens a lot of doors. It'll make a lot of specimens available to researchers around the world, not necessarily just in the English speaking world.
Well, that sort of leads us into the next question, which is about best practices. So why don't we go to that one, and we can always go backwards also. So what are we all feeling like are the most important best practices to develop around AI and our use of it? I really appreciated what you said at the beginning, Will, about documenting our environmental impact. And that's one of our questions later on that we might get to in the end. But I think I love the idea of actually having data to make these sorts of assessments. And when our group met to talk about this, we talk about this webinar. We're sort of talking about the idea of like our impact versus the impact, our being the collections community and its use of AI versus the impact of using AI to make funny cat videos, for example, and the relative environmental impact of those two things and whether it's really comparable or not. Are there any other best practices that folks are thinking about amongst our group here you think would be important for the community to think about specifically with regard to AI?
Yeah, I think that since our data is being scraped without our permission, sometimes that we should think about what we make accessible. Biocultural data and sensitive data. I don't know what our community standards are for making sure that that data doesn't enter AI pipelines, but I think that that's something that's worth discussing. Sort of that's more best practices for how to keep things from being used improperly and not best practices for how to use AI in your own institution. But I think that that is an important conversation to have too. I don't have an answer.
Jordan?
Yeah, this kind of connects to the first question too. I think that maybe one balanced approach, if we're thinking about allocating time, is just like your approach with with georeferencing. I think there's parallels there of there were programs to expedite georeferencing so that everything would get a point on the map. Because if you know the level of resolution and confidence in the georeferencing that you're dealing with, you can make sure that you've scaled your questions accordingly and that the question that you have can be answered. If you just say, show me wild outliers geographically, okay, well, that's something you don't necessarily need really, really precise things for. But if you're trying to extract really fine climate information from a very detailed raster, well, then you need really, really good georeferences, and bad georeferencing can throw off your questions. So I think that one of the best practices would be, what level of confidence do we have in the generation of these data and transparency about which kinds of transcriptions were done with AI and have not been checked by people. And that way, I think the researcher has to, or the user, whatever their purpose is, has to accept some responsibility and say, all right, I need to make sure that I'm asking questions that can be answered with the data that I have. But we can be really transparent about how much effort and how much quality control we've put into it. And then we have these, sort of really curated high quality data sets that we say, right, this is as good as we can do. And then other ones where we're like, this is something so that it helps in the discovery and so that you can use it for different applications. But, it comes with a bit of a caveat.
Will, yeah, go ahead.
Great. I have 2 points that Jordan reminded me of. So one is that internally at the University of Michigan, we processed 80,000 images that had no funding source for us to manually transcribe, and otherwise probably would have just sat on a hard drive for maybe 10 years before we had, the funding to do anything with it. And by processing that, it took 2 or 3 hours. And because of that, we were able to find 10 or 20,000 images that we could support with a different grant because they fit a certain geographic region. So things like that are incredibly useful just from an internal point of view. I think there's a more complicated answer to whether or not that data should be public. I think that's up to the collection. It depends on how much trust you have in those data. So I would say if labels are typed, I think we're basically already there, and I would say it's almost as accurate as a human. If it involves any handwriting, then you start to get to more complicated answers. A lot of the newer models, even in the last 6 months, have improved again, and handwriting is becoming less challenging for a lot of these models, but errors are still going to persist. So I think this is what I think I'm interested to hear what James has to say about it too, but it's really important to track the provenance of all of these inputs. And historically, that's been specimen specific. But going forward, I think it has to be field specific. So every single cell in a Darwin Core spreadsheet has to be annotated for where the data came from and if it's been reviewed or not. Most of our data systems don't support that right now. Fortunately, folks like Symbiota and potentially Specify are thinking about this and are developing tools that can accommodate that. But data provenance is very important because we have a huge extreme. On one hand, some specimens might be literally perfect right out of the box from the AI transcription, and other ones might still require a human to do everything. So that we're still going to have a full gamut.
That also kind of connects what both you and Jordan were saying, connects to the next question, which is about attribution. And I think like we're thinking about it as when we pose that as a question, we were thinking about it more from the perspective of transparency and wanting to be really clear about like datum in a field was generated by a human or by this model or that model. But there's also like to Jordan's point, your interest in who provided those data could also be driven by what your downstream use of the data are going to look like. So there could be applications of our data that would be very, very, very sensitive and need a really high degree of accuracy. But then there might be other uses of the data where maybe it's less important that accuracy is, we're spending a lot of time on quality control, which also gets to the fourth question, which is about error rate too. But James, did you want to say something?
Yeah, just echoing what Will said, that it's really important to keep track of what models were used and what has been verified by a human and things like that. And just to give you some context, the models that are the AI models that Will and I started with don't exist anymore. And so things are moving so fast. And in many ways, that's good. Like a lot of the models that are newer are better, but it's really important to keep track of what you've used, so that we can kind of know what's going to need to be evaluated for those specimens, or potentially maybe there's a time down the line where it would be worth rerunning them.
Yeah, definitely. So, oh, Kim, go ahead. Yeah.
I think that's where having the actual photograph comes in handy. So even with a human transcribed label, you're not guaranteed that it's done accurately or perfectly. And so there's an error rate with human transcription anyway. And so having some way to capture verbatim the data, not formatted according to our database necessarily, is ideal. And in an image, that's the best preserved method to be able to run it again at some future point.
Well,
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's a critical distinction between AI transcription and human transcription is that the types of errors are going to be different. Arguably, I would say one of the worst mistakes a human transcriber could make is probably just missing something. So you just don't include a piece of information or it's put in the wrong cell, something like that. With AI, a year or two ago, hallucinations were a much bigger problem where it could just make things up and that ends up in your database, which is not good. That's not a significant problem anymore. It still happens from time to time, but it's a lesser problem. But if our goal is to get information, parsing it into the right field may not be as important as getting the taxonomy perfect or getting the collection date perfect. There are fields, so like a habitat description might also be the locality, and it's one sentence. So splitting that between 3 Darwin Core fields, it's not a huge issue because all of the data is still there. If it all ends up in just habitat, we can work with that. It's still searchable. You'll still be able to find the information. But if the taxonomy is incorrect, that's a much bigger problem. Or if the collection date is wrong, that's a much bigger problem. So yeah, we have ideas of dealing with that. Obviously, human quality control is the gold standard, I would say. But there are also other tools, just running multiple AI models and comparing the results. And if they agree, there's a higher chance that the answer is actually correct. Also, on that note, we need better gold standard data sets to compare everything against. So far, all of them have seemed to be, sort of convenience, things that we've quality controlled. But we need to do a better job of getting difficult data sets together so that we can stress test some of our models to make ourselves feel better, I think.
so attribution, we've kind of touched on this a little bit. Is there anything else that anyone wanted to discuss in this area? So one of the things that we had originally prompted us to ask this question was thinking about all of the work that goes into creating a specimen, from the collector in the field, whoever is processing it, into becoming an actual specimen, and then all of this additional work that may be done either by a human or by AI. So at this point, we've talked like the fields in the database that potentially could be annotated with whether they came from a human or were generated by Gemini, let's say. Um, is that, do we need to think about giving attribution for other types of work that also go into the creation of specimens? Jordan.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's also, it's not, I think, largely new to AI. AI just maybe exacerbates the problem because of the scale. But this recognition that, as Will was mentioning, that this critical component of the taxonomic identification around which everything else in most of the work that we're doing is organized, they do not come labeled in nature with what the species is. And that is someone's intellectual contribution and hard work to put that identification on there. And typically these just get aggregated, especially if they're being scraped for by AI-based models. And so you could have, a really powerful publication about rare species distributions in the Amazon. And it's the result of, the accumulated lifetimes of work of many, many botanists who your analysis does not really even need to think about, because you could just pull the names and pull all the information from a scraping. Now we similarly, if you do a large iDigBio or GBIF download, you're kind of in the same boat of the volume of records that you're dealing with is so large that it's really not practical to go through and list every person who made a contribution that way. But I think it's really worth thinking about our professional metrics and our sort of reward systems in faculty and in researchers. That this is very time consuming to put an expert identification on a specimen, and it's the beginning of all the downstream analyses. So these are great tools, and it's great to be able to combine all those large data. But our current reward system is set up that the people doing those kinds of analyses are disproportionately credited compared to the people who generated all the raw data on which they're relying.
Yeah, it's a really important point. Part of my job here today is to keep an eye on time. And so I think maybe we should move on to our next set of questions. So I'm going to share my screen again, and hopefully it will work this time. So our next set of questions, I'll pop this up and then I'll do the same thing and paste the questions into the chat. So our next couple of questions are related to application. So this is thorny territory, obviously. So what should we allow AI to do with our data very broadly? So are there legitimate and illegitimate uses of our data when it comes to AI? And also a thing that I think many institutions probably are dealing with is AI and related sort of data gathering methods, mostly scraping and bot activity, but not necessarily. Scientists' own activities can look very similar to that. And these may be posing problems for our institution's infrastructure. So how can we deal with that issue while not thwarting quote unquote legitimate, whether there are or are not, we can discuss uses of those data. So I'm going to do the same thing. I will stop sharing and I'll paste those questions into the text or into the chat here. So we've been having discussions just amongst ourselves here and with our colleagues at NYBG about the first question because we've experienced the second question, which is like giant scraping of many terabytes of data that actually like slowed down the entire NYBG network, and that we were pretty sure we were able to identify as like meta bots that were probably scraping herbarium data. Well, we know they were scraping our images and data. So that was one where we were sort of able to figure out that it was a use we might maybe consider illegitimate, that we didn't necessarily want. But that's questionable. Like, how do we make that judgment call? What is illegitimate and legitimate when it comes to our data broadly? But then I think this is not obviously a new question necessarily, but it's similar to many of the things that we've been talking about today, just the scale of data that is now being made more available thanks to these new methods kind of makes the question maybe a little bit more urgent and pressing. So anyone want to ruminate on this? Leanna?
I think the easiest thing to say is illegitimate are things that are violating, ethical and cultural uses of our data, things that violate care principles, things that are maybe counter to Nagoya Protocol. I mean, the easy things that we've already committed to upholding, and so any uses that are counter to those, I think we could easily say are illegitimate. It is difficult to draw a line where does legitimate end and illegitimate begins. And I think it's hard to say, oh, we don't want a corporation making money off of things, although it feels gross. But I don't know. It becomes a sticky situation if we don't have a stance on it as a community of how open we want. We want our data to be as open as possible. So it's hard. It's a hard question to answer, I think we're realizing.
Yeah, definitely. Will?
Yeah, I think this is one of the hardest questions in today's session. It's really challenging to figure out, like you're saying, what is a legitimate use? Because on the one hand, most of our data sets probably are Creative Commons 0 or something like that already. And it's unfortunate that for-profit institutions are just mining our collections, because a lot of institutions have servers that are not set up to accommodate that level of traffic. Okay. So when a company just tries to scrape your entire database all at once, we get to deal with the consequences of that. So it's tempting to want to just lock that behind the door, but then I think one unfortunate reality is if it's on the internet already, it's already in someone's private data set already. So I don't think we can protect anything out there already. We can just mitigate perhaps how it's collected in the future. But at the same time, I guess I would rather have accurate taxonomic information in some of these models than inaccurate. So I don't know. Yeah, so I think I like to be part of the discussion. This is happening whether we like it or not. So we may as well give our little voice where it counts, I guess, is my opinion. Because none of us know how this is going to turn out, this being AI in general. So I guess I'd rather see our data used in a way that we can contribute a little bit. It's not if they're just scraping it, but that's kind of up to us as a community to probably be more active in how it's used internally. So we need to work better together on how we create tools so that maybe they take notice and incorporate some of our contributions.
Yeah, Jordan, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with Will. I also think that the approach would be, I think, open public discussions about the ethical considerations about biodiversity collections, because trying to put the cat back in the bag or to keep it in the bag is very difficult and often kind of explicitly opposed to the spirit with which they were digitized in the first place, or the requirements of the funding agencies that said this is to be made available for the public. Well, a corporation, I don't know how you would even make that distinction legally in our system, but somebody running a set of servers out of their basement is a member of the public who paid taxes, presumably, that went to digitize these collections. And at least according to how most of ours were digitized, one of our responsibilities is to make it available to them for basically whatever purposes they would like to use it for. Now, as Leanna mentioned, there's sections of that we carve out and we say, no, these ethical considerations are too great, and we're going to make an exception. We have to protect rare species from poachers. We have to respect culturally sensitive information that's been trusted to our institutions. But I think that overall spirit of somebody's going to use this in a way that we would rather they not use this. I don't think locking down is the solution, because as we found also, institutions of our size cannot afford the kinds of solutions that would actually protect it if they are motivated enough to try to get it. So you could set, a volume control and say, if you're hitting the site this often, we had a series of blocked IP addresses for Tropicos. And what it did is it just made a whole bunch of little IP addresses, and they scraped it a little bit slower until it reached below the threshold that we were catching it. So right now we have a login requirement. I imagine it's only a matter of time until it finds its way around. I mean, we are emailing people logins individually as they request them to access data on Tropicos, because we're getting scraped so hard. There's a technical question of just practically, how do we stop our systems from crashing? And I don't have a good answer to that. In terms of the ethical, I think trying to engage with the public about the sort of a biodiversity data literacy of this seems like an inappropriate use of these kinds of resources, or this seems more ethically aligned with what these collections were gathered for, and why we've spent so much effort to maintain and to study them.
I think as
Kim?
an extension of that, I'm thinking about our international community of users. I mean, we have our local users and we think, yeah, they have paid taxes, they've contributed to the digitization of these collections, but what about the countries from which these collections originated and all of the people, the generations thereafter, who, if we were to impede their access to these collections further, I fear we'd lose a future generations of people who care about protecting biodiversity. And so how many more barriers do we put in place to protect our infrastructure without thwarting free access to our collections? And the non-commercial commercial side is a touchy one. I mean, we generated funds to digitize these collections through numbers of private and federally funded means, with the understanding that they would be publicly available. In my opinion, they are rendered as close to the real object as possible, so not really creative in terms of copyright use. And so then it becomes a matter of just managing the flow. But there are limitations to that, we have found. So how do we limit the flow to the point where we're not thwarting access? Or we just condition the community to become comfortable with logging in. But I think that there are ways to get around that too. So it's definitely an ongoing discussion that we need to have beyond just the members of this panel, for sure.
Any other thoughts anyone wants to share on this?
Let me say something, Emily, if it's okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Gil.
No, I'm
Our
not
guest
part of your
panelist, Gil
team.
Nelson.
So I guess I remember going through some of this in the early days of digitization, when folks would say we produce all this data, and then these guys that are making money on using these data to survey properties for development. And my feeling was always, thank God they're using good data, so that maybe they'll actually figure out what's out there that they shouldn't destroy and find ways to protect some of that stuff, because they're trying, as a person who has done some of that kind of work, it was always helpful to be able to say to a landowner, you've got some rare things here and you should figure out how to protect this habitat or whatever. So, I mean, I think this is a very, very difficult question, and I don't know the answer to it, but I think we have to be open to the fact that if people are using the data for surveying for rare and endangered species and species that are listed by state and federal governments, we should be proud of that.
Yeah, thanks, Gil. Will?
Yeah, I just had one really quick last point, which is I think most of what we've seen so far from a hardware point of view is large companies scraping the whole data set, but that isn't necessarily going to be the same problem forever. So now a lot of Gemini models, ChatGPT, they can search the internet, and they're doing a lot of they're just doing a lot of searches on their own, which can also end up taxing a lot of these websites. And it seems like maybe half of all internet traffic is already that, which is insane. So that's only going to get worse as time goes on. So I think it could also just mean that we need to invest more resources in our servers, because I don't think that problem is going away anytime soon.
Yeah, I think something I've been thinking about lately as we've been having these conversations here at NYBG is just that, like, we've been talking mostly with IT, but we probably also need to be talking to like our teams who are doing finance and budgeting, because we're all very well aware that we only are ever going to need more image storage and more server space and more. But as I mentioned earlier, and as we've touched on, a lot of the, like, again, quote unquote, legitimate activity might be scientists like Will. We've talked about how, like, you also will go in the course of your research and potentially scrape millions of images. And we can't distinguish you from a bot, especially if, like, you're doing that by a script that you've written. Like, it looks identical. So to some extent, like, we just have to accept that the game has changed, and institutions to the extent that they're able, which they may not be able, like this is just the new norm now. Like we also have been getting a lot of activity from GBIF, and we reached out to them and we were like, hey, like we've noticed an uptick in your polling from our site, and they were like, oh yeah, that's it's what we do, right? Like they just happen to be getting a lot of, like, again, probably legitimate activity from GBIF via our site pulling images, and it was like, okay, well, we're not going to prevent that. We're not going to stop that. That's making the assumption that traffic that's coming from GBIF is scientists and, it's our community actually using our images for their intended purpose. And the volume of those intended purposes, I think now is just higher. So maybe this is just something that we need to accept, as this increase in volume is a real thing, both on the sort of scientific and educator side, as well as the maybe more nefarious side, if we even could define what that is. It sounds like we probably can't put a really well-defined definition on that. I want to move us to our last set of couple of questions. We're going time flies when you're having fun. So this is our last set of a couple of questions related to things we're already starting to touch on here, of course, sort of ethical, big picture questions. So the second of these we've already talked a little bit about. So how concerned should we be about the environmental impact of using AI for collections? But then the first that we were thinking we could talk a little bit about is how AI might change the roles, or will change the roles, of people. And are people going to become obsolete in collections? I would say no, but this is something maybe we can talk a little bit about. So same deal. We can pop those in the chat so everybody can see them. And I think we're already starting to see the first one happening. Kim, do you want to?
Yeah, when I think about the roles of peoples in collections, I think about those entry-level positions that we've come to rely on so heavily for these massive digitization projects. They're undergraduate students, or in some cases, high school interns who might be helping us for a short period. And will we continue to be able to offer those positions if AI can do some of that easier work for us? And that's a concern to me. How do we train the next generation, or continue to provide paid employment for the next generation of botanists when AI can do so much? Maybe it's just a matter of pivoting what they do for us and with us.
Jordan?
Yeah, we had a similar concern because there has been such, I think, a powerful way of engaging a new generation of people in natural history collections. I mean, the volume of college students working in herbaria from the ADBC program just exploded, whereas there used to be maybe one or two opportunities. I do think, though, as we're thinking about data quality, that there's a chance there to make the case that this is an opportunity. It takes some of those tasks away out of the hands of those students, but it doesn't change needs for physical curation of the collection. And there's a bunch of questions that AI, at least at this current stage, can't answer very well. And those sort of deep dives to improve the data quality and saying, okay, yeah, the way I've been thinking about it is like, what do I need your brain for versus what can I use this computer to do? And we still need people's brains for a really wide range of things, of those difficult questions in collections. So I think there's also a question in the Q&A that was answered via text, but it's relevant to this, of kind of like, are we really expected to add this as collections people to our repertoire? And in addition to all of the other things, that we're expected to be well versed in, and now we have to be large language model builders and competent users. And I think we're kind of in an intense period right now where it's a lot of people teaching themselves or trying to develop these tools. A lot of thanks to Will for taking a disproportionate amount of that work on. But I think once those tools become better developed and better understood and more user-friendly for the average user, I think it will be more of a complementary tool and not something that, like, not everybody's going to need to have Will's level of expertise in this. We're lucky to have Will now and have him developing these things very kindly, so that the people like me who do not have Will's background don't have to try to figure that out for themselves, and can just sort of benefit from the tools. So that was kind of an answer to two different questions, but.
Anyone else wanna? James, and then Jill. Yeah, James, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess in our collection, since we're primarily just using this to transcribe specimens, that takes some of a job away that is one of the least desirable things for students to do. So it's nice in that it's remote, but otherwise it can be pretty mind-numbing. And it doesn't go away entirely, so there's still an opportunity for students to do quality control and essentially get some database experience. But for us, that's allowed us to have our students just do other things, and there's plenty of other things for them to do. And many of them are hands-on with specimens.
Yeah, that's a great point. Jill, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think again, like sorry to jump in here, but I think also to, I think one of the problems with collections is often, we're talk about the siloing of collections and not being, not knowing who's using this information. I think thinking about people and the importance of having somebody that can be dedicated to communications and understand, trying to spend time identifying who these stakeholders are, who is interested in your data, and trying to form relationships with those people are really important because there is this assumption that people are coming after this data for bad reasons, maybe, or, we're just not sure. But if you can identify who those people are and form relationships with them, you might be able to have mutualistic relationships that you can actually help them to find better information or information in a different way rather than them trying to figure it out themselves, and vice versa. So I think that, a lot of it is just that collections aren't, we're feeling like people are feeling like they're not getting the credit that this information's being taken and used, and they're not necessarily getting the credit. But if you can kind of get ahead of that and try to figure out who those people are and try to build relationships with them, it might make future opportunities for you, for your collections, and maybe even financial opportunities that you haven't considered. So that's just wanted to throw that in there from a little different perspective.
Yeah, thanks. And it's a sort of along the lines of like we might have to do things differently. Like people's roles may change, and that's how I think about the answer to that question is like AI is not going to replace humans. It's just not because there are, as we've talked about, there are always going to be things that humans are better at. And I kind of, in a way, I really like the idea of like, let's figure out the things that humans are really good at and that humans really want to do. And then if our roles need to change a little bit, where we're doing more of that and we're giving, also, I don't know, I think it's kind of ironic. Like we always talk about how much work we have to do. Like Kim mentioned it, like this work is never going to be finished in all of our lifetimes, even if we stopped collecting right now. And here are these tools that could potentially really help. And then we complain about them. So I don't know, just sort of interesting to think about. How about the second question? So the environmental costs and sort of that kind of side of ethics. Will, put your hand up very quickly.
Oh yeah, that is definitely something we think about a lot. I in the intro slide compared all of Voucher Vision's usage so far. I gave a kilowatt hour, and it's essentially comparable to single pieces of lab equipment that exist by the thousands at every university. So I'm not saying that our impact isn't significant. It is, but I think a lot of it is just being smart about how we use it. So if we're running one specimen through and then keeping track of all of that data so we never have to look at it again unless models improve to a point where it's worth it, then we're being efficient with our time because, like we've said, it could take us 10 years to get through a backlog of 80,000 images. So science doesn't benefit from those hard fought collections for 10 more years. So it is a huge trade-off. But I would argue right now it is the most efficient thing to do. There's always ways of improving efficiency. One of the weird things that I don't feel comfortable with, but seems to be true, is that running large language models through paid services probably is more efficient than running it yourself, which feels wrong, but we get to fill in gaps in their server downtime. We're filling in the gaps so everything is getting used optimally. That isn't true if we just buy a GPU ourselves. And then we have to deal with maintenance. We have to deal with things run slower. So like with Voucher Vision, you can do tens of thousands of images an hour. If we run it on our own GPU, it's one at a time. So it's hundreds of specimens per hour. So it's just the magnitude of difference. So I think it's just really important to keep track of it, be mindful of it, and make sure that we're not wasting anything. One potential pieces of waste is something that we probably won't be able to control, which are the bots that continually perform things like Google searches automatically. We don't really get to control that, but I imagine that is a substantial use of electricity, is just searching our databases in a way we can't even really control.
Yeah. There's James is answering. There's a question in the chat right now from Devin about being aware of the environmental impact of using AI. But if there are newer programs or newer models that are coming through, would that mean like doing it all over again? Would it sort of like necessitate, or would there be too great of a temptation maybe to do it all over again with new technology? So is there anything that we are doing or can do to sort of offset that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And to some extent, we've already been tempering our usage, I think. We're a cautious bunch, I think. We don't want to see mistakes end up on GBIF and then it's really hard to fix after it's up on GBIF. So I think most of the collections that we've been working with have waited to make sure that it's actually going to be accurate enough to put into use. So yeah, when I say a new tool coming out, I envision that being more as like an error check down the line. So maybe like 10 years from now, there's something that's almost perfect. But we're almost at the point where I think most of the time it's already in the 80 to 95% perfect range. So we're already to a point where I feel comfortable most of the time with a lot of these specimens. So I think revisiting this, it would hopefully not be, a common occurrence, but it would be down the line where we have something that is, nearly perfect OCR, for example. So yeah, I would hope that we're smart enough not to just keep running the same specimen over and over and over, but it is all about the trade-off. So if we can get a perfect transcription 10 years from now or 2 years from now, who knows? I would still argue that's worth it if it just means that we're correcting errors that we are creating now or in the past.
Jordan?
Yeah, I agree with Will. I also think that, as difficult as it can be to come up with an estimate of the environmental impact of running some of these models, I really liked his comparison, because I don't hear many discussions about, for example, we're going to start a spirit collection, and the environmental impact of the fume hood of having that spirit collection, of continuously needing to top off this high quality ethanol that you're also ordering, which is being shipped in trucks to get to your institution. Like, it kind of reminds me a little bit of The Good Place, the TV show, of like these incalculable, when you really start stepping back and saying, what is my environmental impact of being alive? And it feels sometimes like we're applying a very different level of scrutiny, I think, just because it's so present in the news and in our awareness. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be thinking about it, but that we apply a level of scrutiny to these AI approaches. I also think we generalize about AI, and when people talk about it, they're thinking about these gigantic corporate programs. So for example, the examples that I gave you of Vitus, those were AI-based models for that analysis run on an individual laptop. So, this is not blowing the system up. Now, if we start adding every species that's in the herbarium and trying to run that, that's probably going to be a bit too big for a single computer to run, and we'll have to run that on a cluster. But AI in and of itself is not necessarily an environmental behemoth. The issue is, yes, if you say, I want to train a series of bots to scrape the entire internet every minute until the end of days, and I'm going to store every piece of information in case it might be useful someday, well, then yes, you're talking about an enormous amount of resources. But that's typically not what we're doing. And I think as a community, so far we're taking a pretty conservative approach to saying, where is this useful? Well, we're usually taking a conservative approach because we don't have access to the servers that are that large. We're very limited in our IT capabilities. So a lot of it's being run on individual laptops and individual computers or small clusters held within institutions. So it's not that I think we shouldn't be concerned, but I think we're applying frequently a level of concern about this, really out of proportion with our general environmental impact, even with things like air conditioning in collections, which we generally think are necessary and a good thing, but have we are definitely using more energy to air condition our collections, at least at our institution, than we are on AI models to do transcriptions and scanning analyses.
So it's 3, and we were going to try to be very good about ending right at 3. But Will, you have your hand up. Do you want to have the last word here?
Oh,
Seems
sure. I was just
appropriate.
going to answer Eleanor's question really quick because I think a lot of people share it. So for small collections, we're already stretched for resources and things like that. So I would say right now, Voucher Vision is free to run. You could run your entire collection if you wanted to, and then keep it for a rainy day for when you have time and the ability to quality control that. And in the meantime, you get access to some level of data. You have some more awareness about your collection that you can rely on to make decisions in a more informed way than you would have otherwise. So I would say maybe take advantage of that for now. And I'm happy to talk about that, at a later date. But yeah, I would say use it now, and then you can always save it for any day. We do that in our collection also.
Cool. I just want to thank everybody who joined the panel today. It's been really fun to talk with you all. And I think, Shyla, we're going to hand it back to you to say a farewell. And I'm going to say farewell right now because I have to jump off. But it's good to see you all. Thank you. And thanks to everybody
Before you
who
jump
watched
off,
today.
Emily, I just want to tell you thanks for saying yes when I wrote you and for bringing all these people together. This has been a fascinating discussion. It reminds me of the early days of ADBC. We're talking about the same kinds of problems, but with a much more sophisticated set of solutions. And I think that's very exciting. We've come a long way in 15 years. There's no question.
Thanks, Gail. Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you so much. And yeah, so I just want to say thank you again to our panelists for taking the time out of your busy day to join us today. Just a quick reminder for our audience that, like with our other webinars, this is recorded, and I will go ahead and post the wiki page where you can find past recordings as well. And I also wanted to do a quick plug for our next webinar on the 11th, digital data in systematics and biogeographic research using fishes as an example, featuring speaker Larry Page. So we hope to see you there. So thank you again to our speakers, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Go ahead and end it here.
Thank you.